Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Smithsonian Social Studies Online. We are so excited to have you join us either live during the webcast this morning, or if you're watching this later on, we're happy to have you here. So today, our topic is Girlhood, It's Complicated. My name is Abby Pfisterer. I'm an education specialist at the National Museum of American History, and I'm so excited to have you joined by my colleagues today, who we'll introduce in a moment. But before that, I'd like to go over a couple of norms for today. Please, if you have any questions, use the chat either through the Facebook or YouTube portal that you're watching on to ask them. Our guests are very excited to hear from you and have a conversation. But when you're using the chat, please don't enter any private information. That's for you. We don't want that. And please remember to keep it as civil as you can. We have our terms of use in the bottom of this description if you'd like to reference them. We also have a link there to the Learning Lab collection that you see on the screen, and we encourage you to follow along. So again, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Orlando Serrano.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for being with us. We are excited for the conversation we're going to have with our guests today. And at this time, I will introduce each of them and ask them to say a little bit about the work that they do at the National Museum of American History, and then we'll start talking about a project that they've been working on for the past several years. So first we have Kathy Franz. Can you say a little bit about the work that you do? And then Nancy Burkhoff.
Yes, thanks, Orlando. I'm Kathy Franz, and I'm a curator here at the National Museum of American History, specializing in the history of technology work and, of course, women's issues and women's history. So I'm really glad to join the conversation today.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Burkhoff, and I'm a curator in the Division of Political History. And what I specialize in is thinking about the politics of everyday life and really getting us to think more deeply about how our actions are political. And so I was really delighted to join the Girlhood, It's Complicated team.
Thank you both for that brief intro and for the segue opportunity that you provided, right? So Kathy, you mentioned you do a lot of the work, or a lot of your work focuses on women's history's issues and matters. And Nancy, you talked about how you are curious about the ways in which everyday life is political and the things that we do on a day-to-day basis are part of these processes. So with that said, can you give us a little bit of background on the exhibit that you all worked on, Girlhood, It's Complicated, and how it sort of combines those two ideas?
Sure. Girlhood, It's Complicated is an exhibition that was conceived of to honor the anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. And we honor that with a twist. We didn't do just a straight up history of women's suffrage because we really knew that other Smithsonian museums and even our museum were going to do dedicated exhibits that really dived into that history deeply. So we wanted to do a little twist on that and really think about what it means to grow up female in the United States over time. So this exhibit explores that from different angles and really thinks about the politics of gender in each of the sections of the exhibition. So there are 5 big sections. There's education, work, wellness, and fashion, as well as a few individual biographies of girls that really take up specific topics like Title IX or coming of age or girls leadership. So we really think about that bigger topic of being identified as female, and we think about it as being historically specific, but not necessarily as natural or fixed. So we bring a lot of questions to that as historians and ask, principally, how do we make girlhood? How do we maintain it? And how have we reworked it over time?
Okay. Thank you for laying out the structure and the organization of the exhibit and some of the thinking behind it. I do have a question that I hope you all can address. I know it's a very large question, but can you say a little bit more about gender and the construction of girlhood as an idea? And then we'll dive into the different themes organized around one cultural resource per theme.
Sure. And I'll just say, and invite Nancy to join in here as well, that, we have a great video at the beginning of the exhibition. And because this is an exhibition, it's not a book, right? We want to explore that question of gender and how we make gender expectations and gender roles in the US through people's stories, what they tell us about their lives, their lived experience, through visual artifacts and through material culture. So we do our best work as a museum when we're not just telling folks what gender is and how it changed over time, but we allow historical actors in the past and today to say what their experiences were, and then allow all of you and the audiences that visit the museum to really come with your own questions and your own conclusions and takeaways about that. But we do have a fantastic video in the experience that really tackles some of the myths of girlhoods, like all girls grow up with a girlhood. All girls are middle class. They don't work. They have their own bedrooms. They have plenty of consumer power. All of those things. And we disassemble that through one girl's story at the beginning, one of our fellow curators, Mireia Loza, who's not here with us today, and really just start to ask critical questions that bring us to, well, girls are part of this complex process of what we say girlhood, and by extension, what it means to be identified as female has been historically in the US. So that's not a direct question or answer, Orlando. It's more like, here's how we tackled that.
No, and I appreciate it because, it reminds me of just being in the classroom and my students would ask me a question and they say, Mr. Serrano, what is this? And I say, I don't know. What do you think it is? Here's what we might think it is. So I appreciate the, and Socrates is proud, I'm sure, wherever Socrates is, that we're asking questions to help folks, uncover what they may or may not know already. Nancy, is there anything you want to add before we start talking about this first artifact here?
Well, I guess going back to the question of questions, we had certain questions. So who gets to be a girl? What does it mean to be a girl? And then what are all of the different messages if you are born and identified as being a girl? What are all of those issues that you face? Where is it uncomfortable? Where does it not fit? How do you actually tell society who you are? And how does that fit into certain assumptions about girlhood and other ways completely disrupt them? So it's the fact that we're all living and confronting these larger structures in our society who tell us who we are.
Okay. All right. Thank you both for providing a door into the thinking and to the organization. And we're going to start here with our first artifact. And we have a scarf here. And what can we know about this scarf, or what does this scarf let us know or provide an entry point into with regard to girlhood, and which theme are we talking about here?
Yeah, so the theme we're talking about is news and politics. And Kathy and I, when we were focusing on the scarf, we were like, what does a scarf have to say with politics? You don't think of this beautiful orange fluffy scarf as being very political. But this is a scarf that was worn by Naomi Wadler, who was one of the dominant speakers in the March for Our Lives. And she was 11 years old when she gave a speech before hundreds of thousands of people. And the story I love about Naomi is that, she was writing her speech right up to the last moment, and then she had to figure out what she was going to wear. And there's always tension when you're 11 or when you're, 46 about what you're going to wear. And so her mom wanted her to wear something bright, and she really wanted to wear something, really substantial. So she wanted to wear black. And her aunt knit her this scarf that night, and she called it a 2-movie scarf. But The same way that a scarf doesn't at first glance seem to be political, it kind of ties into our larger theme that girls at first glance don't seem to be political. But what we really are asking people to think about in this exhibit is the fact that politics runs much deeper than what we traditionally imagine. It's not as simple as being a Democrat or a Republican. That people are political, girls are political when they speak up.
Mm-hmm.
They're political when they support a cause. And they're political because they're constantly confronting messages of who they're supposed to be and answering back. So girls have been political in really formal ways since the founding of the nation, really expressing their own political views. And then we really think that girlhood itself, being a girl, makes you political because you're constantly faced with society's expectations and how to speak back.
Yeah, no, I've it's interesting, you know, in the era of Zoom in which we live at the moment, conversations I've had with friends, with family about Zoom meetings and what one wears to Zoom meetings. And to your point earlier, you know, I'm not saying no folks who identify as men don't think about what they have to wear, but I definitely hear a lot more from the women in my life who talk about the discrepancies between how people present themselves in these meetings and, you know, the decisions they go into. What should I wear? Something as simple as that, you know, when you're in front of a large group of people, becomes a broader question and has more impact and has more depth. And I appreciate the way that you all, and you know, because I am who I am, I like that. I like this image because it looks like a portal, and you know that we're using something, or you all, not me, are using something as everyday as a scarf to look into this moment and the impact that this young woman had as a speaker at this rally. All right, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next artifact. And, you know, for folks who are at home, I want to review the different themes that we're going to be heading into. We're going to we just talked about news and politics. We have education, work, wellness, and fashion. And I'm assuming we're going to talk about education a little bit here.
Yep, you got it.
All right.
So this is actually a patent model of school desks. And these patent models were made a lot between 1860 and 1880. And it was all about schooling, as you can see, and how you're regulated, how your body as well as your mind are being regulated when you go to school. So the tagline for our section on education is called Being Schooled. How are girls and children schooled in who they should be and what are society's expectations for them? But if you look at this patent model really closely, look at it. The desks are rigidly in a straight line. You're sitting straight. So I'm actually right now trying to imagine myself sitting in that chair. And your body is facing forward. There's no way to turn to your neighbor. There's no way to learn to face any other way besides facing the teacher. So schools, by and large, are really ways that people are trained to think about how to discipline themselves and also how to break up their days into hours and class periods, how to be punctual, how to sit still, and how to focus. So we use education to think about, you know, if we take these desks, to think about them more broadly in terms of what do girls face when they go to school and what are the expectations that are placed upon them. And I think the most important point that we really wanted to drive home is that not all girls' futures are imagined the same way. So we all know that certain schools have gifted programs and certain schools do not. Certain schools have resources and other schools do not. So if you're a girl going through these different educational systems, you have a different future that's imagined for you before you even have a chance to imagine your future for yourself. So we use this section, Being Schooled, to think about all the different ways that society kind of lays out its expectations for you from the moment you first interacting with it. So that's basically what we're tackling in this particular section of the show.
Yeah, those desks do not look comfortable. And, with, different conversations that Abby and I are a part of with regard to resource development for schools, the idea of being school, being sort of prepared to be a particular kind of citizen. But then that's something that we think about often. But then the way that you all have added the idea that there are some limitations or foreclosures that happen for particular young women before they even walk into the building, right? Where imaginations are cut off.
But of course,
yeah,
the imagination still thrives.
Oh, yeah.
So another big part of this section is a section called Unschooled, which is when girls tell us, no, this is what I'm about, and this is who I really am.
Okay. All right. We're going to transition to our next artifact here. And this one is an image. So we've had two material objects, and now we're turning to a visual text. And what do we have here?
So this is a portrait, obviously, and I want everyone to think, who is it a portrait of?
That's a great question.
So portraits like this of young African-American nursemaids with their white charges, who often during slavery actually could have owned that young woman, that girl, were very, very popular. And if you think about it, why did this family take these children into the studio and have their portraits made? And it's not necessarily about the nursemaid. Instead, it's about the white child that she's caring for. But she's important in the picture because she's displaying the family's wealth and status. So she's visible there for a certain purpose. But what we really wanted to do was explore, what does this mean? What does this mean from her perspective? So in the section work, it's called, Hey, Where's My Girlhood? So these young African-American girls from the age of 3 were really already performing these tasks. There are these amazing slave narratives from the times of slavery, people remembering back, of trying to actually carry these enormous babies when they're babies themselves.
Yeah.
So these girls are working at a very, very young age. So the questions we're asking here is, what would it feel like? What would it mean to care for an infant who's also your boss or your owner? And how would you feel if you're caring for an infant who actually gets a childhood when you don't?
Yeah. Or, or for, or who's, or thinking, I appreciate the way that you all have positioned this, and and the question that I had to add on to what you're saying is, or how would you feel if it's your job to make sure that this person gets a childhood at the expense of your own, right? Like that's
right.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and you're asking that of a very tiny person.
Yeah.
Like 5, 6, 7. How do you put that into action and into words? But this is part of a larger section of the show that really examines the fact that girls have actively contributed and built America. So that children and girls' labor has really, as you can see in this picture, give other women leisure time. Their labor gives other women leisure time. They also have been working and making industries profitable from the early founding of the nation. Their cheap labor helped spark a consumer revolution. And Kathy will get to this later, but their activism also reshaped labor laws. So girls have been working and continue to work. And we don't necessarily consider that as part of girlhood. So we wanted to complicate that.
And you have successfully. I mean, in our brief conversation right now, I have not had a chance to be in the building since March. So I'm looking forward to getting into the exhibit and seeing everything up close. But this image is very striking. And I have more questions that we can talk about later, because we can. But thank you for providing some of those questions that you want, folks who come to the show to think about. And what, as I'm walking away from that particular text, the main one, one of the main ones I have is how much, to summarize some of the points that you brought up, Nancy, how much labor was able to happen because this, and not just that young woman, but many young women like her did what they did, right?
Right. And
So,
that's true today,
Yeah.
that the majority of our produce that we put on our tables is really picked and harvested by girls.
Yeah, and what I think about some of the young folks who I worked with, when I was still in the classroom, where they said I can't play soccer today. I got to miss practice because I have to go home and take care of X, Y, Z. And I appreciate the historical grounding of a contemporary issue that we are still, like you're saying, living through and experiencing today, whether we are aware of it or not.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got a form-fit sanitary apron here, and what wellness I'm going to go with.
Yes, this is an artifact from Wellness, and there are two pieces to this, a front and a back. So it's two-sided if you at any point want to switch over to the other. That has a picture on it to show you what the object is. So really, we wanted to show some objects that people may not have seen before for this discussion, like the tiny patent desks, that photograph, which I think we don't necessarily see photographs necessarily like that. And here's another artifact that may have been lost to time. But why is it in the wellness section? And what does sanitary mean?
Yeah.
And so one of the things you said early on, Orlando, was that, probably boys don't get as much advice on what they wear as girls. They don't have to think about that as much. And one of the things that we say broadly in the wellness section is, growing up female in the US means that you probably get way more advice than boys. There's just over the last 150 years, there's been a ton, literally a ton of advice aimed at girls and how they comport themselves, how they manage their bodies, how they control their bodies. And some of it is about dress. A lot of it goes to menstruation, which we've seen in recent years of concerted effort on the part mostly of girls and girl activists to destigmatize menstruation. And so we really wanted to talk a little bit about that in the exhibition because the collections at the museum are so rich in material around menstruation. And we know not everybody gets a period, right? Not everybody gets a period on the same timeline. We know that menstruation was misunderstood by doctors for a long time. Why are these people bleeding? Is it just, that really all didn't coalesce until the 19th century to put that together with reproduction. And that menstruation rates and the age at which females menstruate has changed dramatically over time in the US from the 18th century. So around the time of the American Revolution, a girl, if you menstruated your first menarche or when your first menstrual cycle, usually came around the age of 18 or 19. And today it's around the age of 12 is the average age. And that number, that age drops dramatically in the 20th century. So in the early 20th century, the 19-teens and 1920s, with rising standards of health and nutrition. And of course, that's not true across all American communities, but it does start to mean that bodies matured more quickly. And this becomes a concern for American health professionals, religious leaders, community leaders, and lots of people are giving advice to girls. The other thing is this move to connect to work, the move of young women, often in their teens, outside of the home to work, to help support a family. We just had an example of somebody working within somebody else's home. But there is this move between about 1880 of large numbers of young women, whether they're coming as immigrants to the US or they're leaving farms to go into factories and clerical work in cities. And so managing menstruation is really a part of that. How do you work through, literally, that week or whatever? So manufacturers, advertisers jump into the game. This is a market, right? Not only a labor market, but a market for products that help young women manage their bodies. And so we see things like this. This is a precursor to sanitary napkins, which come just slightly later. This is early 1900s. And we'll see by the 1910s, 1920s, the availability of the sanitary napkin, which replaces cloth. So young women are using everything from sphagnum moss to cloth diapers that get repurposed. And this, you can read this and think about, well, why would you want a rubber skirt? Was it really comfortable?
Oh my, yeah, right. Oh.
It says it's form-fitting. Do you really want to stand or work in an office and remember, work hours are 13, 14 hours a day, whether you're standing at a machine or doing clerical work. Do you want to wear this thing? And then back to this question, which I would let us or viewers or people who visit the exhibit really think about, what does it mean to be sanitary? And what does it mean to be sanitary in public? And what are the implications? What is that telling girls and young women about not being sanitary, or, practices at home or practices that don't fit this national standard? So it is a kind of trying to assimilate young girls' bodies into ideas about what's acceptable and not acceptable. And so there are a lot of things that can be played out from this object, and just change over time as well, in terms of actually managing periods and where we are today with pushing back. I like this object because it so reminds me of stigmas that lasted well into, even my girlhood in the 1980s and 1990s, about not having access to sanitary products at school, maybe having forgotten them, having to tie your sweater or your jacket around your waist because that's unacceptable or stigmatized. So all of those things that girls really have to confront and have confronted for a long time fall under this section of wellness.
Yeah, no, Kathy, thank you for the background and the context for this particular object. And no, I mean, I had lots of flashbacks to grad school right now, and my anthropology course is on blood taboo, and the way, that women, and in particular with regard to blood and the idea of being sanitary or having to wear, like to your point here, something made from the purest and finest material that can just easily be cleaned with some warm water to quote unquote be clean. That's an interesting anchor object to think about the ways in which women and young women's bodies in particular, as they're navigating these changes in their lives, are having to, again, think about what they're wearing, and how they're, being quote unquote like controlled or policed on some level.
And what the demands of both industrial capitalism are for young women's bodies in the workplace, and then consumer capitalism that tries to make you always feel unsanitary, so you always buy the product, right? So anyway, I know we need to move on.
No, we do, unfortunately, and we're for folks out there. We're going to go a little bit over time today. We usually try and wrap up in 30 minutes, but this is a new exhibit, and we've got some interesting conversations still ahead of us. Abby, before we head to our last object and then do our couple of thinking routines, anything that you'd like to add or interject?
It's an incredibly fascinating conversation. And I agree, Kathy. It's so many flashbacks to my own girlhood, positive and negative in many ways. And one of the things that Nancy, you said earlier that just really struck me was that you said not all girls' futures are imagined the same way. And how powerful a statement, and something for us all to reflect on when we think about the girlhood that many of us had, or others who did not have that, but then of the girls we see today. And that means a lot for me with a young daughter. So no questions yet, but this has been an incredible conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Abby. No, and I'm definitely having my daughter, who is going to be 13, right? And we're all on like, what's happening now, folks? Because to your point, Kathy, we know that the age has dropped, and we're like, all right, preparing her for this conversation and trying to destigmatize something that's natural, but knowing the pressures that she's going to have, right, when she's in school, and if it happens to happen at school. Anyhow, we turn now to to our last one, which has to do with fashion, and only because I know a little bit about this object. I just read a blog about it. I appreciate the way in which Abby's comment, and Nancy's reminder that some folks continue to have an imagination that grows and flourishes, even though people try and stamp it out, as a good way to start talking about this object. So, Kathy, what do we have here?
So this is a prom dress, designed and worn in 2018 by a young Choctaw girl, Isabella Ayukli Cornell, who is in Oklahoma, and who became an activist very early in her life. As young as 12 and 13, she was speaking out about issues that are important for her and her community. And then she became very involved with her mother and a community of women elders in the tribe in terms of highlighting a national crisis around missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is real. It is extensive. The numbers on it are pretty amazing when you look at the number of women who suffer abuse and are go missing or who lose their lives. And so she wanted to take that up and put it on the stage of prom. And what we know is that prom, which started as a pretty elitist event for upper middle class or upper class girls and boys in the 19-teens and 1920s, and survived like that, became more available, more part of the high school routine for most high schools, is still important today. But one of the things I think girls and boys as well have really innovated in the last 5 years are political prom clothing, right? So you still get the dress, you still make a statement, but that statement now can be a political statement. And I think throughout this conversation, we've come back to or alluded to how clothing can speak, right? And how girls can be dress coded, they can be policed for their clothing, but this is the flip side. This is using what you're wearing to say something, to make a statement, which girls have done for a long time. And this is just an absolutely beautiful dress. It's from a designer and maker in Montana, who is Della Big Hair Stump. And it is an amazing wool bodice with embroidery. So it's a Pendleton blanket or a wool blanket. Yep. And then this satin skirt, which is amazing. And we don't have the photo of the shoes here, but there are some great ruby slippers that go with this. And she coordinated with her date, who also had a tie that matched this. So it's an amazing piece. And, I think really points to a long trend, which is using your clothing to upset the standard quo and get people to ask questions, but also to have a direct political message.
Yeah, this is a beautiful garment, and quite practical, because I did not realize it was a Pendleton blanket. I was like, that's a very innovative way to make it a stunning dress, but still be warm in Montana. That was brilliant. And again, the way or how dress is political, and we can incorporate statements with our bodies, which I think is one of the through lines that we've come through in our conversation today. All right, we're gonna do one last piece together here. We have two more artifacts to look at, and what we're gonna do is a thinking routine called Think, Feel, Care. And the way that this routine works is there are 3 questions that folks try and answer as they think through a particular object. And so I'm going to pose a question so viewers out there know what the questions are, and then I'm going to ask each of you to take a turn to respond to these 2 objects. We've got a set of butterfly wings, and the questions are: think, how does this person understand a system that they are in and their role within it? Feel, what is the person's emotional response to the system and their position within it? And then care, what are this person's values, priorities, motivations? What is important to this person? So I'm not sure who's going to speak to this one. I think I have a guess, but think, feel, care. How do we think about this artifact using those prompts?
Well, these wings were collected from right in front of the museum, and they were collected in I think in 2017. And it was the day that the DREAM Act was going to come up for a final vote in the House of Representatives, and it failed. But there was a huge gathering, and it was after President Trump had already vowed to rescind DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act. And so there was a large gathering in Washington, D.C., and people wanted to meet right in front of our museum at the National Museum of American History. And this one young woman was from Nebraska, and she traveled this great distance in order to express her views. So the monarch wings are symbols of really undocumented Americans, and they represent the fact that monarchs travel great distances in order to survive, and that the travel is, if you imagine a fragile little being like that traveling thousands of miles, the migration is treacherous, and the migration is beautiful, and the migration is necessary to survive. So what was she thinking? She was thinking that as a human being, that her life should not be under duress, and that she as a human being has a right to thrive. What was she feeling? She was feeling that was not being recognized by our society, and that her life was being limited, and her life in many ways was limited, not just in terms of opportunities, but in terms of housing, healthcare, survival, nutrition. And then the final one was feel. And what do we do with feel, Orlando?
Oh, no, the last one was care. What are the person's values, priorities, and motivations, and what is important to this person?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's really been striking about undocumented organizing is the fact that it always privileges the community. So that if you do not have access to a lot of things, you don't have access to services from your county, from your state, from your national government, you're still cared for.
Mhm.
And that through the act of organizing, people are organizing with one another. And we have a major initiative where we're collecting around this topic because it's really been very impactful. But one thing that we've really learned is, like, by the act of thinking and caring about what's going on with your community, that just that simple act of seeing another and recognizing that compassion is a primary motivator is something that really expresses a truer notion of what it means to be political. That you're actually, as a member of society, caring for others and making sure that their needs are met when they're not being met by a formal form of government.
Okay. That's a very powerful story to this artifact, this object. Thank you very much, Nancy. And we're going to turn to our final artifact for the day, which is a shirtwaist. And again, as a reminder, the three umbrellas are think, feel, and care. And think, how does this person understand their role within a larger system? Feel, what is this person's emotional response to their role within this larger system? And then care, what are this person's priorities? What's important to them? And Kathy, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about not necessarily the young woman who would have worn this, but the young woman who probably made it. And, you know, as we said a little bit earlier, there's this huge influx of young women, often in their teens. So as young as 13, 14, all the way up into their 20s, moving into cities and working in sometimes clerical work, but often in factories. Many of those factories are sweatshops. And one of the very popular items to hit ready-made clothing in the period between 1900 and about 1915 are these shirtwaists. So they serve working women in the sense that you can always just put on a different shirt instead of a whole dress. They're easier to clean. Right? You're easier to get dressed if you have versatile pieces that allow you to, say, go to the office with the same skirt every day, but just a different shirt. You're also probably not wearing a corset under this, so there's some more freedom of movement moving in, but they're wildly popular. And so manufacturers start making these in huge numbers, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And you can just think about, you know, how we just pull clothing off the rack in a store today. That's a fairly new experience in the early 20th century. But these are some of the first ready-made clothing that's inexpensive. And so people had multiples of them, not just one or two, but maybe more like 5 or 6. And what does that demand? It demands that somebody makes these, right? And if they're going to be inexpensive for a consumer market, the person making them probably can't make a lot of money, right? So there's a lot of cost here in terms of fabric and the factory overhead, and then there are wages. And so manufacturers, business owners tried to hold down wages in order to make these things as cheaply as possible. And most of the factories are women and young women who don't have children yet and are going into work. The workday is anywhere between 12 and 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week sometimes. So they are really working. So this person is thinking, you know, using a sewing machine or doing some hand sewing on this, you know, where's my girlhood?
Absolutely.
Right. I'm here to make money to help my family. Will I ever be able to afford a garment like this? I feel exploited. And these young women in this period, and the working conditions are terrible, right? So crowded, the rooms filled with cotton lint or whatever fabric clippings there are, you're breathing those in. I'm not even talking about making the textiles, just the sewing of the garment, the creation of the garment. Big, high, rise, 9, 10-story buildings, windows not open so that the stuff doesn't get dirty. And you're basically there at your sewing machine all those hours a day. But you have lots of other young women like you next to you talking, if you're allowed to talk. Or you're getting together after work and you're questioning, why is the boss making all of this money off this booming business and I don't have a share of that? So that's what they're thinking. They walk off. So there's an uprising of tens of thousands of young women in the exact period that this is made in 1909. And as probably the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is 1911. And in those years, the Ladies Garment Workers Union is able to organize about 90% of young women who made these shirtwaists. So in their efforts to walk off the job, which was a risk, you could lose your job, lose your safety. So it was definitely a risk. You could get hurt. These are not nonviolent protests all the time. They took those risks, a calculated risk, and were able to win real labor reforms for everybody. Shorter work days, 14 days off of work in a year, so some beginnings of a vacation, and safety protections within the factory. And of course, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, that tragedy, which young women were the center of that, who lost their lives, really pushes that even further to be not just contracts with your boss, but true labor law reform as you get into the 19-teens and 1920s. So I think that's what she's thinking. I think there's a mix of feelings. We don't know exactly who worked on this garment. It's mass production, but we think that, you're taking these risks. You feel scared, right? You feel motivated. And when you actually win, you feel both a sense of camaraderie with your fellow workers, a bond together, like you're making a difference, and elation when you actually make that difference. So.
Thank you and this is I just on a like an artistic level or a creative level, the amount of detail that goes into this work and the stuff that folks are inhaling as they're doing this very detailed work over long periods of time is one half of the story, and then the other half that I appreciate you reminding us, because one of my of a documentary, a story that I really enjoyed that I used every year with my young people is Girl Rising, and they remind us that when girls win, everybody wins. And I appreciate the reminder here through this story. All right, folks, we have come to the end of our time together today. We appreciate Kathy and Nancy, you being with us today and speaking with us a little bit longer than we usually do. This is the thinking routine that we used called Think, Feel, and Care. It will be available in the comment section as part of the learning lab that we use to navigate our conversation today. And this last resource that we have here for folks is an excerpt from the American Historian that is helpful reading for the conversation that we had today. Before we head out, Abby, can you wrap up our time together, remind folks where to go and what's coming up next?
Absolutely. So again, thank you for joining us today and for sticking around through an extended episode. Such good content to cover. We couldn't possibly have cut it short. So if you would like to find the resources that were featured today, the link is here on the screen. You can also find it in the chat where you can click directly to the Learning Lab collection where all of the objects and the supplemental resources can easily be found. And we certainly hope you'll join us for our next episode later on this month, where we'll be talking about Native American Heritage Month and bringing in some incredible experts from around the Smithsonian to help us explore this topic and create connections between the history we know and the history we should know. So thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.